election will all come down to the electoral votes.
Good morning. My name is Cassie O'Brien. I serve here as one of the associate pastors at Flatwoods Church, and I would like to welcome all of you to worship today. A special welcome to those of you who are worshiping with us online. When I was a kid, I had a reoccurring dream. Yes, I still remember this dream vividly 30 some odd years later. I will offer you the abbreviated version this morning to spare your sanity. Maybe a little, but it always began with me sleeping, and I would be awoken in the middle of the night. I would wander out of my bedroom and find a wasp. And rather than retreat, despite my extreme fear of all things that sting, I would follow the wasp down the stairs to a home full of people. And one by one, the wasp would sting them, and they would turn into vampires. My mom, my dad, my older brother, all of their friends, and it would end with me trying to escape, unable to run in a desert full of igloos. Weird dream. Yeah? No? Totally normal. I have always been a vivid and frequent dreamer, but I've never really assigned much consequence to it. As a descendant of the Enlightenment era or the Age of Reason, which has guided much of our modern and postmodern thinking, prescribing some sort of divine meaning to what my brain conjures up in its unconscious state does not really compute for me. And yet, much of our ancient world, where our biblical tradition rests, shares this understanding that dreams are an uninvited communication from God. And in the midst of these illogical and often perplexing visions, a message from God can be found, a holy purpose that needs some interpretation. Dream stories are all over the Bible, both in the First Testament and in the Gospels. Even the last book of the Bible, while it's not necessarily a dream, it is a vision, right, or revelation that is offered to John. We also have dreams that are found in the Christmas story that we just read last month. Joseph is met in his slumber by an angel telling him that his fiancée would soon have a child. And later, an angel appears to him in a dream again and instructs him to flee to Egypt with his family. The other is when the wise ones from the east are warned in a dream not to return to Herod and to go back to their home following a different path. The Old Testament has lots of dreams too, given both to God's people and also to those in positions of power. Sometimes God offers them a promise, and other times dreams serve as a warning about the peril that is to come. But each time, the dream becomes a catalyst for change. In the darkness of night, when their bodies and their minds are at rest, God plants a vision in the dreamer's mind. And that dream disrupts what they are doing, and it prompts them to do something new. For those of us who may be a little skeptical, like myself, that our dreams are a way for God to speak to us, modern day psychology and neuroscience has found evidence that dreams actually provide some benefits to us humans. I promise this is more evidence than the Dream Bible. Yes, that is a thing. Like it tells you if you dream about an octopus, that means somebody in your life is really controlling. But dreaming, what happens in the REM cycle of sleep, does have purpose for us, even if we don't remember what happens when we wake up. Matthew Walker, he's a professor at UC Berkeley and the director of the university's Center for Human Sleep Science. Yes, that is a thing. He wrote a book all about it called Why We Sleep: Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams, in which he summarizes that dream sleep is actually healing, kind of like an overnight therapy session, allowing us to reprocess upsetting memories in a safer and calmer environment. His studies show that dreaming enhances both our creativity and our problem-solving skills. Basically, dreaming is awesome, and it can change your life. However, the only way we can take advantage of these benefits, the only way we can dream, is if we rest. This month at Flatwoods, we have invited you to take on a different kind of New Year's resolution, one that doesn't make you do more, but rather invites you to be, to rest, to stop, to participate in God's command, to remember the Sabbath day, and to keep it holy. Sabbath is one of the practices that we believe that when we do it with some sort of rhythm and regularity, it can change our lives. In a culture that says go, 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 and do, that commands that we achieve and build and produce, God says stop. And so first we named rest as a gift, one that God offered to us from the very beginning of time, that we are called to hold on to and to cherish. Then we explored the commandment found in the Big Ten, in Exodus, and also Deuteronomy, that tells us that rest is not just for you. It's not just for the privilege. It's not just for the power. You can't take advantage of rest by making others do the work for you. No, rest is justice for everyone. And last week, Pastor Evie showed us how rest is an act of resistance, pushing against the systems of power like industrialization and capitalism that demands that we produce more and make more no matter what the cost. And so when we do this, when we rest, when we name the gift that's been given, when we create space for others to rest, when we push against the systems that overwhelm us, it can change us. It can heal us, restore us, and dare I say, transform us. In the fall of 2023, my grandmother, who is my familial expert in all things birds and bugs and plants, she brought my girls a gift. It was 3 tiny caterpillars in a clear plastic container packed with parsley. Around the same time, Naomi's preschool class also had a caterpillar cage. And in both places, the larvae feasted on their leafy greens and slowly cocooned themselves into a chrysalis. At home, sadly, one of our triplets, God rest their soul, left this world prematurely. We were sad. I'm not really very good at keeping things alive, and so I was satisfied with our 2/3 success rate. But each day, Naomi would come home and tell us about how a new butterfly had emerged at school, and well, at home, nothing. The parsley died, the cocoons became dark and dried and brittle, and I assumed that this 66% success rate had plummeted to nothing. So instead of cleaning the cage, I did what I always do. I just stuck it up on a shelf in the garage, and I left it all winter long. Through snow and ice and cold, there it sat. Until last May, when we were prepping to move down here, I was cleaning out the garage and I looked up on the shelf, and can you guess what I found? 2 butterflies fluttering around in their temporary habitat. I have never seen 2 little girls and 1 mom so excited. I may have even cried, but that's a different sermon that we won't have today. But this season of rest for these creatures, this long, drawn-out, cold, icy season, led to transformation. The caterpillars literally transformed into butterflies. They became something new. Rest is transformation, and yet we push against doing it. We reject it, and we say, no, that's not for me. You know, anytime I've ever preached a sermon on Sabbath or taught a small group, and I ask people, well, how are you practicing Sabbath? This is also the same answer I give when my boss asks me this question. Do you know what they say? I don't have time to rest. My schedule is too full. I have too much work to do. There are too many demands on my life. I have work and I have school and I have kids and. The other response I get, although not nearly as often, is if we've actually decided to try out this whole Sabbath thing, is I want to rest, but I don't know how to. Does this ring true for any of you? Anybody? Yeah? Well, let's start with the first. I don't have time to rest. When I hear this, I also hear the same people, myself included, often express how tired and exhausted they are. I stumbled on a podcast earlier this month in preparation for today called Burned Out, start here. It's an interview between Ezra Klein and Oliver Burkeman about his latest book, but he also talks about his earlier book called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. And the premise of the book is this, that in the expanse of time, we only live a very short duration. If you live to the age of 80, which is actually greater than the average life expectancy here in the US, you only live about 4,000 weeks. That's it, 4,000 Sunday mornings. 4,000 chances to say, thank God it's Friday. That's not a lot when you think about it. So how do we fit all the stuff that we want to do in this limited scope of time? How do we manage our time? How do we produce what we want? How do we create systems that make us the most efficient? And the big idea that comes from the book is this, that there is no productivity system anywhere that will ever deliver what it's promising. A sense of control, a feeling that you have mastered your task list in some enduring way, that you've built a levee strong enough to withstand life's chaos. Anyone else feel this? Like January proved this to be true for me, that no matter what I did, there was no levee strong enough to withstand the chaos of life between record blizzards and children's fevers and even a case of head lice. It broke down my certainty that I had created any system that would give me any kind of control. And so rather than coming from the presumption that somehow life and time can be controlled or managed, what if instead we came from the presumption that it can't? What if we actually recognized our own limitations, our own human finiteness? That shocker, we aren't God. We cannot control everything or anything, really. When we say, I don't have time to rest, even though God has offered us this gift, even though God tells us to do it, it implies that we know better than God does. And when we cave to the machine that says, if I work hard enough, if I push through, if I persevere, I will get it all done. But we all know once one task list is checked off, there's just another list. The work's never actually done. And so rather than turning to systems of productivity, maybe we return to the gift of rest. Rest is necessary for us. Studies have shown that when you don't rest, both your brain and your body don't work like they should. You gain weight, your immune system becomes weaker. There are psychological risks like anxiety and depression and paranoia. All of the systems in our bodies, from our respiratory to digestive to cardiovascular to endocrine, they don't function well. Your memory worsens, your mood changes, and well, your body just isn't at its best. And so what if instead of thinking about what we're missing out on, and saying, I don't have time to rest, what if we realized what we're gaining? That maybe we aren't really losing time. Maybe it's giving us more time. Maybe we can be more efficient and focused if our bodies and our minds are working correctly. Maybe we can be better problem solvers and more creative in our work and in our life. Maybe we're less irritable, so we can be more kind. Anybody else get cranky when they're tired? Just me? Okay. And maybe we realize that we don't have to be a part of this endless hamster wheel of productivity, that we can do this resting together, that we can create a caring community where we can dream and explore and imagine new possibility. Instead of being tired, exhausted, and burned out, what if we accept Jesus' invitation when he says this to the crowd in the Gospel of Matthew? Come to me, all you who are struggling hard and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest. Put on my yoke and learn from me. I am gentle and humble, and you will find rest for yourselves. My yoke is easy to bear, and my burden is light. Jesus shows us a different way, a lighter way, and all we have to do is rest. I'm hopeful at this point, after the past several weeks, that perhaps you've made a commitment to take on this resolution to rest. But maybe you're still in this place that many people are that says, okay, I'm ready to practice Sabbath. I want to rest, but I don't know how. I'll admit I'm really bad at this too. When I do find a minute to sit down and rest and do nothing, I don't do it well. I'll find myself mindlessly scrolling social media. Anybody else? Or binge watching too many shows, filling the empty space with mindlessness. I don't think that's the kind of rest God had in mind. I don't know about you, but when I do this, I'm never really restored. Often I'm just more tired. In 2015, I took a trip to the Holy Land, and while we were in the city of Jerusalem, Sabbath took on a whole new meaning for me. If you remember, our first introduction to Sabbath comes from the creation story in Genesis, right? Where we hear that on the seventh day, God rested. And so when we are commanded to keep Sabbath, it was commanded as a communal experience. And this is still very much part of Jewish culture and practice. And so on Sabbath day, or Shabbat, which occurs on the seventh day, beginning Friday at sundown and lasting to Saturday at sundown, one of the rules is that no one is allowed to operate electrical switches on the Sabbath, because that would be work. So you can't work on the seventh day, right? So while we were visiting the city, I woke up on a Saturday morning, right in the middle of Sabbath, ready to go get breakfast, and I went to the elevator, and something very strange happened. It opened and closed on every single floor, even if there was no one to get on or off of the elevator. They were auto-programmed, so no one had to push the button. So no one had to work. So everyone could rest. This experience was mind-blowing for me. There was a whole day every week that everyone rested. What would that be like? You know, we have to be intentional about our rest. Taking Sabbath is hard, but we are probably not going to live in a society, at least not in the foreseeable future, that reminds us to rest. No one's going to make us do it. No one's going to make it easy for us. There will always be emails and phone calls. There will always be practices and games. There will always be something that we need to do. So how do we do it? Especially when it seems like everything, even ourselves, is working against it. Rest is more than just sleeping for the appropriate 8 hours each night, but rest is anything that slows you down enough to connect your body and your mind. This probably means turning off your screens. It's things like meditation, taking a walk, exploring creation, gardening, working with your hands, doing things that bring you joy. It's also meant to happen in community. This is part of the reason church names Sabbath on Sunday, because it's the time when we gather together for worship, for community, for meals, even for play. And finally, rest is when we are connecting with God, both in community and by yourself, through worship and prayer and experiencing scripture. But more than that, rest is a way of relinquishing control, to stop trying to manage all of the things. Rest requires letting go and saying what I've done today or this week is in fact enough. Rest is vulnerability because we don't have control anymore. When you're sleeping, you are probably in your most vulnerable state. That's why in movies or shows, every time there's some sort of threat at nighttime, people take turns staying awake, right, in shifts. And it's in those spaces, these moments of rest, where the uninvited communications from God come. This happens both in our waking and in our sleeping, dreaming in our slumber and letting our minds wander in the daytime hours as we dream and discern about new possibilities. This daydreaming happens when we're sitting at our desk or taking a walk, hopefully not driving a car. But these moments of daydreaming can happen anywhere when we slow down enough to just pause. In the book Pastor Evie mentioned last week called Rest is Resistance, the author talks a lot about the importance of daydreaming, letting our minds wander, resisting the urge to fill the silence with our phones or other screens. And she writes, daydreaming creates energy. It allows me to connect with the deepest ideas and offers space. Space to just be and to become free from the demands of the fast-moving, nonstop culture is so important. This space where we dream and also daydream creates change. If we listen to our dreams, it can prompt us to do something new. Like we said earlier, there are lots of dream stories in the Bible, but I think the most famous dreamer and interpreter of dreams is probably Joseph. Do you know his story? His story spans 14 chapters in the book of Genesis, more than 25% of the book, and it's a long narrative. And if you recall, Joseph is one of 12 of Jacob's sons. He's also known as the favorite son, and he has some pretty, let's say, arrogant dreams that cause his brothers to get mad and sell him into slavery. And while he's in Egypt, he has the opportunity to interpret some pretty famous dreams. In Genesis 41, Pharaoh has a couple of odd dreams. And he can't find anyone to interpret them, but he's told about this guy named Joseph who had correctly interpreted the dreams of a butcher and baker while in prison alongside him. And so Pharaoh asked Joseph to give it a go, to figure out what this dream means. Let's read the dream found in Genesis 41, the first 8 verses. It says this: Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing near the Nile. In front of him, 7 healthy-looking, fattened cows came up out of the Nile and grazed on the reeds. Just then, 7 other cows, terrible-looking and scrawny, climbed up out of the Nile after them and stood beside them on the bank of the Nile. The terrible-looking, scrawny cows devoured the 7 healthy-looking, fattened cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He went back to sleep. He had a second dream in which 7 ears of grain, full and healthy, grew on a single stalk. Just then, 7 ears of grain, scrawny and scorched by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the scrawny ears swallowed up the full and well-formed ears. And then Pharaoh woke up, and he realized it was a dream. In the morning, he was disturbed and summoned all of Egypt's religious experts and all of his advisors. Pharaoh described his dreams to them, but they couldn't interpret them for Pharaoh. And you thought my mutant wasp dream was weird. This one's odd too, yeah? So Pharaoh invites Joseph to come interpret this dream. And Joseph does what he is asked, and he brings some clarity to this nonsense. And he says, this really is one dream, not 2. The healthy cows and the healthy corn means there are going to be 7 good years of harvest, and the scrawny cows and grain mean that there are then going to be 7 terrible years of devastating famine to follow. And so what does Pharaoh do? He sees Joseph's interpretation as wise. He puts him in a position of power to help solve the problem. And so when we look at the dream, I don't want to think about the content or even the interpretation of it. We could, right? That would leave us here until about noon. We're not going to do that. But instead, I want us to think about the effect of the dream. Now, I'm not hailing Pharaoh as some sort of hero here, but the dream does precipitate some pretty good results. This dream puzzles him to such a place that he starts to ask questions. He gets a little curious. And then he starts to build a community of people to help him answer these questions. And then he's given wise counsel from Joseph, predicting that soon, in a few years, Egypt would experience this extreme and devastating famine, and Pharaoh changes course. You know, Pharaoh is very good at managing time. He's good about being productive and pushing. But the real change that happens in Egypt comes not from his wisdom or his ability, but it rather comes from this dream that God has placed in his unconscious mind. The dream causes change. Just this past week, we marked a day of rest, at least a day of rest from work, when we honored the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who delivered probably the most frequently quoted sermon in the modern era, a speech about his dream. You know this sermon, right? Okay, just making sure you're still with me. All right. Walter Brueggemann writes this about the speech. He says, King's dream, like every dream, is not simply the sign of a wish or projection, but it is the intrusion of God into the settled world. It has a holy intensity that reaches back into generations of suffering. It is a holy intrusion that reaches forward in sanity, and it continues to generate a restless uneasiness with the way things are until the dream comes to fruition and a new world is enacted. You know, it's evident from this past week that we are probably still waiting for this new world to be enacted. The work still is not done. We're still waiting for what Dr. King dreamed about when he said the heat of oppression to be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. There are more dreams to be had. We are not done yet. But when you are tired, when you are scared, when you are burned out, remember Jesus' invitation to all of you who are struggling hard and who are carrying heavy loads, an invitation to rest. Friends, I pray that you would make space for rest, and that in this rest, I hope you dream. I hope you dream dreams of justice, dreams of mercy, dreams of love, dreams that spur you into change and action. Because when we rest, not only are we transformed, but the world can be transformed too. I would invite you to take a moment, just a minute, to pray in silence. This may be the only opportunity you've had to rest all week. And while you are resting, let your mind wander and dream about what God would have for you. Let us pray.